predictions, 40 of them were well, 4 of them were likely to go to John McCain. So there is still margin here to be answered. It's an academic question now, but one that is still of great significance to those who were involved in this race. But what struck me during that was how much of that speech bookended what Senator McCain said. And these are very important considerations for this country. This is as dynamic a statement as the election of any non-white guy candidate could be for the presidency. This is not necessarily going to go smoothly. We've heard some of the reactions from that crowd at the Biltmore in Phoenix. There's unhappiness. How much of it was more than that? I would hope it would be 0%. Senator McCain reached a hand out to try to knock that down. He asked his own supporters to for want of a better word, cool it. The first thing that President-elect Obama said was addressing this idea of unity and tamping down the political temperature. And I can't imagine that there were more important words said in combination between the victor and the runner-up. We'll call him the runner-up out of respect for that statement tonight. I don't know when more important words have been said in tandem in that sense.
I talked to one of the top Obama people in Chicago today to try to get some reporting on what a transition might look like, and there are 3 watchwords to the new team that's going to be formed in the next couple of weeks to run the country. One of them is bipartisan. In fact, that's the #1 hallmark of what they're going to try to do, is put together a bipartisan government. Number 2, diversity. Of course, it's going to be a diverse government, not just an African-American president, but a truly diverse government is going to be formed. And 3rd, youth and no retreads. They're not going to bring back people from previous administrations to try to rebuild something old that was around before. Now, that, of course, will rub some people the wrong way, but I think it's fascinating. They've already figured out what they want. They want something bipartisan, diverse, and new. And they're going to try to make this work. And the people who apparently are going to play the role in putting this together are John Podesta, who worked, of course, with Bill Clinton in the transition, Pete Rouse, his chief of staff in the Senate, and Valerie Jarrett, who was on tonight. Those 3 people are apparently giving the lead positions in trying to put this thing together. It's going to be one rock'em sock'em news story for the next 3 months. It's going to be bigger than the election building of this new administration. And if it's truly going to be brand new with youth and no retreads and diversity and bipartisanship, I think that hand that was reached out from John McCain tonight is really important. Right. And the hand that was reached back, because John McCain is the best there is at reaching across the aisle, and Barack Obama hasn't done that yet. This is his chance now to reach over and do it with the strong hand that he's got from this incredible mandate from the voters.
You know, we talked a lot tonight about, this is not just what's happening in this country, but it's how the new president will face the rest of the world. Gene and Rachel, Gene, you've worked around the world. The president-elect said tonight, to all of you watching tonight from beyond our shores, he went on, who talks about the new dawn of American leadership. To those who would tear down this world, we will defeat you. Andrew Sullivan wrote, I believe at the end of last year, quote, if you wanted the crudest but most effective weapon against the demonization of America that fuels Islamist ideology, Obama's face gets close. It proves them wrong about what America is, and in ways no words can. What does his face mean to foreign policy now?
It's certainly a different face of America, and that's something that he's acutely aware of. I remember the first time I ever sat down and interviewed him was right after he announced for the presidency, and he talked a lot about that. He talked a lot about how when he was president, he would present this different face to the world, and that in and of itself would be a big factor in helping change relationships, reestablish American leadership in a way that the rest of the world saw as benign rather than malign, in building coalitions and consensus and reaching out to people's across the globe. And it all sounds tremendously starry-eyed and ambitious when you hear it 2 years ago. When you hear it at this point, I think we have learned that one underestimates Barack Obama at one's peril. I now believe him when he says, this is what I intend to do, and that he's going to develop a plan to do it, and he's going to be systematic about it, and he's going to get as far as he can. Yeah. So this is going to be a fascinating administration in that aspect, in America's relationship with the rest of the world, and of course domestically with all the issues and problems that we face, in addition to this huge task of political and societal reconciliation that he has set for himself. Yeah. It is really going to be a fascinating 4 years.
Rachel?
I think that on the issue, I was delighted to hear him say in such blunt terms, "We will defeat you." Mm-hmm. To say that, say, listen, you know what, this is a change of baton in the United States and an important moment in American history. But to anybody out there who identifies as an enemy of America, you need to know that you are still on notice. You are on notice, maybe in a way that you've never been before, that you have a fierce enemy if you choose to define us as one. To hear him say that from a position of strength and from that position of calmness that we associate with his oratory, I think is going to be reassuring to a lot of Americans. I mean, when I think about the national security threats that face us, I mean, I think that the terrorists who attacked us on 9/11 and their brethren around the world, I think they're nihilists, you know, and I don't think that there's anything rational about the reasons that they hate America. I think it's nihilism, and I think they're out for world domination, however crazy it may be. The only thing that Barack Obama's election robs them of is an argument that might conceivably appeal to people who aren't as nihilist about them as them, about the hypocrisy of America, about us trying to speak to the rest of the world about how to conduct their affairs when we have moral weakness so evident in terms of our race relations. That's the sort of thing that maybe was going to help them appeal to people who weren't crazy like them. But they are nuts. And honestly, what we need to be is strong. And what Obama said tonight by putting national security in his acceptance speech is, we will be strong. And if you are our enemy, you will pay for it. And I think Americans left, right, and center want to hear that in a country that still, frankly, has not avenged what happened to us on September 11th.
Let's bring in presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin to join in this conversation. Doris, it's wonderful to have you here. You have talked a lot in the course of this campaign, and you talked about it with our friend and colleague and boss, in some cases, Tim Russert, about history coming alive in this campaign. Well, it came alive tonight. What's the significance of it?
Well, what struck me so much about the speech that Barack Obama gave was that it reminded me of FDR's Rendezvous with Destiny speech, because what Roosevelt said at that time was, our generation has this moment in history, this rendezvous with destiny. And that was the theme, I think, of what Barack talked about. He really thought, I think, before he even ran 2 years ago, that there was a moment in history that could provide greatness. It seems to me his ambition is much larger than simply to be president. He wants to be one of those great presidents. He's not looking to be Millard Fillmore or Franklin Pierce, and that's terrific. I mean,
who wanted to be Millard Fillmore? Did Millard Fillmore want to be Millard Fillmore? I don't think so. But.
No, but you know, Lincoln had those huge ambitions too. He wanted to be remembered by time. And you look at that speech when he talked about 100 years from now, what will people say about what we did? That's a man who wants his story to be told. And if he can move it step by step, he also understood, as Roosevelt did, that you have to have a sense of shared sacrifice, that there'll be false starts, just as Roosevelt talked about. There was echoes of Lincoln in there. This man has a sense of history, but I think most importantly, he made the people out there, these thousands and hundreds of thousands who were part of the biggest turnout in such a long period of time, feel like this is their time as well as his. And that's what he's believed from the beginning, that
Doris,
it has to be changed from the bottom up.
Doris, isn't it interesting? There is a sense out of this speech of destiny. And maybe some people who don't like President-elect Obama may see that as some form of arrogance. He will describe it in terms of shared destiny with the people that he will lead. President Bush, the leader that I've covered, has been so quick to say, to not really talk in terms of destiny, in terms of himself, and to be very quick to say that historians will be studying his presidency for some time, and that he didn't want to hazard a guess about legacy. And yet, in some ways, Obama was challenging his supporters to think in terms of their legacy together.
Well, I think that's important for him because he believes that the only way you're really going to get fundamental change is through a collective enterprise, which means he has to inspire people to feel that this is their moment as well as his. And that's been true in history. I mean, he has a chance, possibly, of an era that may resemble the turn of the 20th century, the progressive era of Teddy Roosevelt, the New Deal, the 1960s. I think he's interested not just in the symbolism of the first African-American being president, but maybe a realigning era that we'll remember like we did 1860 or 1932. And you have to have that passion and enthusiasm to make people feel a part of it. So it's a pretty awesome moment. I must say, the idea that the turnout was what it is today and the enthusiasm of this campaign over this last 2 years, it's almost like the 19th century when politics was entertainment, politics was fun, politics was our sports. It's brought back right now, so he's got that resource. He may not have the economic resources he might have thought before the financial crisis, but more importantly, he's got the resource of the people who are caring and who are going to be active and who are going to do something, and he's going to bring them to Washington, that whole new group of people, or maybe get them involved in the Peace Corps or the Teacher Corps. It's a pretty awesome moment. I know that word is a child's word, but it feels that way.
You know, I'm sorry, go ahead.
How? The simple version of this question is how? How do you take that, Doris? How does a president take that enthusiasm throughout history? What is his model? Because obviously Lincoln did not go to Washington with a big band behind him and a bunch of people saying, yeah, we really want the next 5 years the way they're going to be. And there were many people who doubted Roosevelt and people who feared the future of the country when Theodore Roosevelt ascended in 1901 after McKinley was shot. How do you take the enthusiasm and actually translate it into something productive?
It's not easy, and I'm sure that after tonight, when he goes back to bed, there'll be that awareness of the burden that's on him. I mean, even Roosevelt, when he won in 1932, he said to his son, Jimmy, you know, I've always been afraid of only one thing in my life, and that is fire, of course, being a paraplegic. But now I'm not sure that I have the strength to do the job I need to. Lincoln said, I've never felt responsibility like I feel now. So there's going to have to be that internal confidence that maybe he's going to screw up. In fact, he said there'll be false starts. He's going to have to move step by step. He's going to have to figure out priorities, what comes first. He can't do it all. Roosevelt understood you had to have a vision, which I think Obama has, but you have to move step by step so you build support along the way. But it'll require that same kind of strategic thinking that I think his campaign showed. And the transition team is going to have to do the same. They can't afford the vetting problems that Clinton had at the beginning, which can set you off on the whole wrong track. But it is, you know, but I think if he can learn from history, our best presidents, Harry Truman read history all the time. Obama knows history and reads it. There are lessons to be learned. And hopefully, maybe I'm speaking as an historian who hopes there's lessons to be learned, but I really think there is.
Well, you know, I just wondered, you know, I think, Doris, you can do this as well as anyone. I was thinking that the early 1960s, before the 60s became the 60s, before the Kennedy assassination, when the new frontier was the reality and not this Camelot thing that was confected later when it was colorized, but the reality of that black and white era, black and white television, thin ties, 50-mile hikes, the Peace Corps, the Special Forces, the fight for the moon. Jack Kennedy made the government service something to be proud of, serving your country, not just ask not what your country can do for you, but really giving you an offer like, how about coming and working and joining the Peace Corps? Why not come to Washington? I think the answer to the question Keith just put is to ask. And this president never did it. This is not a tough act to follow, George W. Bush. He seemed distracted. He seemed to want the rest of the country to remain distracted. There was no call to arms, no call to duty from this guy, no sense of shared sacrifice or even involvement. It was like, better to let the aristocrats run the country and stay home in your communities and not bother us. He seems to have an easy act to follow. Just say, come on.
I think you're right, and he'll say, come on, and the people will come. You know, even when John Kennedy first announced the idea of a Peace Corps, thousands of people signed up before there even was a Peace Corps, and he said, what am I going to do? I don't even have a Peace Corps yet. Yeah. But it showed that his campaign had already inspired people to want to be part of it. You know, as you know, Chris, too, we were young then. There was such a sense of excitement about being part of that generation. And I look now at young people, and I'm jealous of them. I'm thinking how lucky they are that this is their first time in politics, many of them, and to have it come to fruition like that. And you're right, he's got to figure out ways to get that enthusiasm working, make politics an honorable vocation again. It hasn't been for a long period of time. Make government service and public service better perhaps than private gain. Those periods in time when people cared about public service, they'll remember them the rest of their lives. Their lives are larger when you have not only your private gain and your families, but you're doing something for your country. And when he talked about that woman who was 106 and what she'd been through, and that a century from now, It's almost like when Walt Whitman was talking about Lincoln, he said that someday people will remember that they knew him. And I think what you're wondering now is, will we look back on this election as we get older and as young people get older and say, we were there at a moment when America finally confronted a lot of its big problems and moved forward together. If he can do that, boy, that's a pretty exciting thought.
You know, Doris, a lot of us today have been thinking about Tim Russert and what he would have made of this night and what a big story this night is.
Oh, without a question, it's terrible that he's not here. And you know, Tim and I talked so often about the temperament of a presidential-elect being the most important quality. And I think you saw some of the temperamental qualities of Obama even in that speech tonight, sharing credit with people openly, sharing it with the American people as a whole, your victory, not just mine, the willingness to admit there'll be false starts. You got to acknowledge errors when they happen, and just that generosity of spirit that I think has been part of his steadiness all the way through. And that's what Tim understood, that leadership can bring out enormous things. You know, even FDR's first inaugural, here he was at an even worse time than now. All he needed to do was show that confidence that the country could move forward. As Obama said tonight, we can do this. And suddenly thousands of telegrams come into the White House. Everything's going to be okay because you're there. I mean, think about the fact that they were singing Happy Days Are Here Again in the midst of the work depression. People are feeling that right now, hopefully.
Doris Kearns-Goodwin, thank you very much. Keith, I remember sitting across from you the night that Tim boldly stated that Barack Obama was the nominee of the Democratic Party and no one will be able to say anything about it. He grasped that moment then and no doubt would just love reporting this story out as we've been able to do tonight. It would, and it did live up to his expectations and to his level of enjoyment and his sense of moment. And that's for us here, that and those of us, those watching who feel the same way about the man who's always in our thoughts. It was good that we mentioned. We'll take a break here and come back. Our coverage continues on MSNBC right after this break.
Experience the power of change.
Here is a look, by the way, at the vote so far, the actual popular vote. Barack Obama at 51%. And counting. It's the first time since Jimmy Carter that a Democrat would get over 50%. And the popular vote totals there. Barack Obama now north of 52 million votes to John McCain's 48 million. We'll continue to watch that spread. 76% of the vote in. And the electoral map, this is how it looks. You saw it on the ice skating rink. Here we are, 338 electoral votes to McCain's 156. And there are some gray areas on there, Keith. We've got Montana. Indiana.
Missouri.
Right.
There's a sizable number out there. It's obviously not going to make a difference, but in terms of history, it is significant. And those races are all individually tight as could be.
Let's bring in our insiders, Mike Murphy and former Congressman Harold Ford of Tennessee. Harold, the meaning of this night, politically, historically?
Big night, historic night. Senator Obama, obviously the history making, but as I said earlier, starting tonight, no child born in America will ever believe that they can't grow up and be anything they want, and every time a parent says that, they're indeed telling the truth. Mike and I have been talking a lot about this, and I want to hear his thoughts.
An extraordinary night, very historic night. I was struck at how gracious both McCain and Obama were tonight, and how essentially they both hit the same note of a national purpose beyond party and politics. There's clearly a huge appetite in the country for that. We're going to have a moment of real good feeling here, which is a tremendous opportunity for Barack Obama. But I've been around politics enough to know how difficult it is to enact. He's going to have to take some of the tremendous amount of political capital he's going to have. He's going to have to spend it, and he's going to have to go to the center, bring Republicans in a meaningful way, and try to build a national purpose government that can put partisanship aside. If he does that, I think he could be a very successful president.
Mike, we're going to spend a lot of time in the coming days talking about how Obama did it, how he won, which will get us into his coalition. One of the big themes tonight, white voters. How did he do with white voters? Some of the exit polls have been revised. They may be revised again. Ron Brownstein from Atlantic Media passed these on to me. The fact that the white gains for Barack Obama were modest, 41% for Kerry in 2004, 43% for Obama at this point overall. Again, these could be revised. Non-college, he loses them 59 to 40. Non-college educated whites. Those whites who did go to college or beyond, he also loses 51-47. So it's still the case, according to surveys, that no Democrat has ever won the white vote, whites with a college education or better.
Well, it's going to be very easy for all of us doing analysis of this to get extremely hung up on identity politics because of the historic nature of this. But the truth is, one of the key and most powerful parts of Obama's strategy was that he never defined himself by race. He never really defined himself as a candidate of identity politics. So, you know, what do his numbers look like? His numbers look like when a Democrat wins big across the country, playing well in most regions and almost all demographics. I think we're going to find out when we get all the full post-election data that he did grow the category almost everywhere. That doesn't mean he won all the groups, but he grew the category. You know, and we got to be careful, too, about setting this as the baseline for all future elections. A mistake it's easy to make after an election. We kind of did it in, 2004. In 2000. It's a pendulum that swings, and I think more than anything else, Obama had a coherent and strong and powerful strategy that fit the times. They executed it magnificently, and he ran a candidate where a campaign where he was not defined by race, and he exceeded all the targets he needed to win a tremendous victory. It was something to behold. Huge credit to Pluff and Axelrod. They did a magnificent job.
And Harold, quickly, if we pull out farther than those demographics, I wanted to mention those because it's something we've talked about a lot tonight. What we look at on that electoral map is a big sweep for President-elect Obama.
Florida, Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, California, New York, New Mexico, Maine, Washington, Oregon. A remarkable, I know you pulled out some of the data showing some of the different identity groups, how he fared. But I got to tell you, I think anybody running for president would love the coalition this guy's been able to put together. Again, kudos to his campaign. He now has to move very quickly, as I think this speech tonight positioned him to do, to begin to think about building a national security team, an economic team. And I'm pleased to hear what Chris said, that he's looking to move forward and to bring a new team in around him and to guide America in a new direction. So congratulations to him.
All right, Harold and Mike, thanks very much. I believe we've got some pictures out of San Francisco as well. Some of the celebration pouring out in the Castro district of the city, as it's known. A place near and dear to your heart, Chris Matthews.
And certainly me, having written for the papers out there all those years.
That may not all be celebration if it's in the Castro and we haven't got the results of Prop 8 yet.
Prop 8 is look, I want to say something. I was once at a human rights campaign meeting in Philadelphia, dinner, and Barney said to all the people there, a lot of them gay, he said, you know, things are changing, and they are, because even in California, where this is probably going to go down tonight, this proposition, or rather passed, it's going to basically throw back a same-sex marriage. If you look at the numbers, it was like 4-1 against same-sex marriage just a couple of years ago, and now I think it's going to be a much closer vote.
I think the thing that's hard, I mean, and again, this is only 22% in, and Lord knows what's going to happen here, but the thing that is painful about the California vote, if it goes this way, for gay Americans, is that this is an existing right that in the wording of the measure, it's very blunt. It's asking Americans, asking Californians to rescind a right that already exists. And that sort of language, that sort of blunt language, it's not, you know, the sky will fall if we approve gay marriage. Gay marriages exist in California, and Californians have seen that the sky hasn't fallen. And to have, for gay residents of California to have their fellow citizens vote to take away an existing right that they have that has caused nobody any measurable harm, I think will be a bit of a body blow on what will otherwise be a satisfying night for a liberal-leaning community.
Keith? All right, let's check in with Newsweek's Howard Fineman at our campaign listening post. We're beginning to talk, obviously, about what comes next for President-elect Obama, who he is being advised by, and what they are telling him to do and when. And Howard has some early readings on that. Howard?
Well, I've officially renamed this now the Administration Listening Post, Keith, and the new administration is a morning. You actually heard it launched tonight in that speech by Barack Obama. That wasn't a speech that looked backwards at a successful campaign. It was a speech that looked forward to the challenges ahead. And I thought it was remarkable for the stamina that he exhibited, and also for the soberness that he showed. I've watched him a lot. I've interviewed him since 2006, and I thought he had maybe I wasn't imagining it, but a sense of burden and responsibility that you could actually see on his face, and they're beginning to look at people already. And it's a complicated picture because there are 4 or 5 circles around Barack Obama. Barack Obama is for change, but he's not an anti-establishment figure. He's a guy who likes to listen to smart, wise, experienced people. He's a young man who elicits the advice of older men and women and who likes to listen to them. So you're going to see him consulting, if not hiring, everybody from Colin Powell and Dick Lugar to Paul Volcker and Warren Buffett. These were not names he just threw out. He's going to be talking to those people. There, in fact, are going to be Clinton people, but he's going to pick the best and the brightest of the Clinton people who helped manage the economy well in the Clinton 90s and bring them back in new roles. He's not hung up on that. So not only will the Clintons suffer the indignity of having been lost and essentially ignored tonight by Obama, but Obama's going to cherry pick the best of the people from those years. There are going to be plenty of Chicago people, including Rahm Emanuel, the congressman from Chicago, who most people think could go into the White House as chief of staff, a tough customer who knows how to make the trains run and knows how to make the Congress work, even if he ends up on the other side of Pennsylvania Avenue.
Is he, in fact, agonizing over whether or not to take the job, as has been reported for 4 hours?
I know Rahm Emanuel agonize, he doesn't. If it's offered, and I'm not 100% sure it has been, if it's offered, he'll take it, because he can advise on how to run Congress, and he has experience in the White House, too, with Bill Clinton, and he knows Chicago, which is key, because this is going to be the Windy City on the Potomac.
Howard Fineman at the administration listening post. Thank you, Howard.
Okay, Keith.
Back to Chuck Todd, our political director for NBC News. Hey, Chuck, a few things have happened since we talked last.
Yeah. I think so.
How did he do it?
Well,
geez,
yeah, there you go. How did he do it? Well, I think you guys have sliced the dice. There's a couple things I want to bring up. Number one is I think Obama, history's going to look back on him, and we've talked about being the first African-American, but he really is the first 21st century president. His campaign was 21st century. Everything about that. And then you think about the generational aspect, and I hope I'm not repeating anything, but John McCain losing. This is the 3rd straight Vietnam veteran who's been a nominee for president who's lost. We may not, Vietnam is a war that may not produce a president. No veteran may not ever now attain the presidency. We now have our first post-baby boomer presidency. There's something about that, and you know, I would love to hear Chris go on this for a while. Chris, a adamant baby boomer in the way he eloquently can talk about this, but it's quite the exclamation point on the culture wars of the 60s that Vietnam may not produce a president, and yet the civil rights movement has produced its first president, and it's the first post-baby boom.
Will the demographics mean a lot with a victory this large? Will we talk about a coalition in a way that is meaningful?
Well, I think it is, because here's something else that's happening with Obama. We saw this in our final NBC Wall Street Journal poll. The love that his supporters have for him. You know, one of the things we talked about was that enthusiasm. And remember, in our last NBC Wall Street Journal poll, a very positive rating of 44%. What did that mean? It meant 9 in 10 Obama voters had a very positive feeling about this. Well, what does that do? That gives you this governing mandate in some ways, because you know you're going to have a large chunk of people with you pretty much whichever direction you go for a little while. It's a nice padding to have to start out when you're trying to put this country back together. The other thing about Obama is I think you're going to see another change in the philosophy of a president worrying about his job approval rating. Obama is probably going to become a 65% president, meaning he's not going to be happy if his job approval rating drops below 65% or 60%. And he's going to start with that that big core of base support that is rather large. Arguably not since Reagan in '80 do you have a base of supporters with a personal love affair right now with their president-elect.
All right, we'll leave it there. Chuck Todd, thank you very much. 5 states still outstanding, including Alaska, where polls close at the top of the hour. We're going to have much more from here around the country and in Grant Park in Chicago, where the president-elect Barack Obama has addressed the American people and his supporters there. Our coverage continues after this.
MSNBC's Decision 08 coverage is brought to you by Liberty Mutual, proud sponsor of election